I freaking love conveyor belts. I love them. I love calculating things to match their capacity. I love the complexity in routing a whole bunch of things through a factory. I love the elegance of a well-coordinated bus. I love it all. But there are caveats, because a bunch of well-coordinated conveyor belts are only ever moments away from total and complete spaghetti. A simple decision here or there, and that love can evaporate entirely. We are talking about discipline. If we can establish a basic set of rules that guide us in our conveyor belt routing decision process, then as long as we stick to that discipline, then we can avoid spaghetti madness. This is of course provided we want to avoid spaghetti madness. I guess if that's not the case, still watch the video. Just do the opposite of what I say. We begin, as always, at the beginning. A straight conveyor belt is more or less infinitely flexible. It can cross other buses and other buses can cross it. At an extreme level, we can even build a small factory over the top of it. But the moment we introduce a bend to that conveyor belt, then pieces of it become fixed forever. This isn't just the case with bends. The same thing will happen if we introduce a splitter to the belt. Some tiles either side and around will become fixed. But a splitter is generally a necessary thing. If we need a splitter in a particular location, then it's because we need a specific junction in a specific place. But a bend is generally optional. Once we add a bend to that conveyor belt, then the tile on the corner and the two belts either side that lead into and out of the corner are now fixed forever. Whatever we build in the factory from now until eternity will need to work around and accommodate these three tiles. They cannot be moved. If we extrapolate this situation to the absolute limits and construct a conveyor belt which is on the 45 degrees, i.e. entirely all corners, then every single piece of this conveyor belt is locked forever. If a straight conveyor belt is more or less infinitely flexible, then a belt on the 45 is entirely inflexible. It will impose itself on our factory. We get no choice. A straight conveyor belt gives us choices. This is just one belt. If we add several belts and put a common corner in all of them, let's just imagine we are trying to maneuver the belts around a particular bit of factory, then our options become even more limited. The only two belts which we can split off and carry on in the original direction are the inner and outermost belts. All of the belts in between are now locked in the middle of the corner. Yes, we could probably intertwine or weave some undergrounds together and get some kind of a thing working, but this is against one of my rules, a rule I will come to later. A big corner of belts in a bus like this, in a similar way to the belt entirely on the 45 degrees, becomes sacrosanct the moment we build it, and everything else that we build in the factory will now need to work around it. We are trying to give ourselves options. We are trying to set up a system where, as long as we follow the rules, we give ourselves the maximum opportunity for future expansion or changes or fixes or whatever. Things that reduce our options are bad. The situation we want in a bus is for each row or column of tiles in that bus to represent a single conveyor belt for the entirety of the factory. No bends or jiggles or anything. Once we put a conveyor belt in a bus, it now owns every tile in front of and behind in that row or column forever. The bus travels in a straight line forever. All of the space in the bus is for the bus, and all of the space not in the bus is for factory. Discipline. It's a big heavy word, but that is what we are talking about here. A factory is a complex thing, and one way to reduce that complexity is to make things easy for ourselves. Give ourselves options. The game is naturally an orthogonal game. It rewards us for building things at 90 degrees and punishes us when we try and do any other kinds of geometry. We need to lean into that orthogonality. So straight lines, always. Going back to that big corner of belts from before, if this corner existed in a main bus in a factory and we needed to route a conveyor belt from here to here, then unless we downloaded a mod with longer undergrounds, this would not be possible without spaghettiing it around the junction. This new belt then becomes an impediment all on its own. Any other belts that need to route through this general vicinity will then need to work around this one too, and so the spaghetti begins. If we build this same cluster of conveyor belts in a straight line, the issue disappears. We are back to a system of more or less infinite flexibility. We are back in a world with options. So this is the starting point. Belts travel in straight lines. Corners and junctions are bad. There will of course be situations where corners and junctions are necessary. It would be impossible to build a factory without them. If something is necessary in a particular location to make the factory work, then it is needed in that location and we should build it there. But we should always be mindful of the fact that the more of them we have, the worse and more difficult things get. And that if we can come up with ways to reduce the number of them, then things will get easier. Okay, that is corners and junctions. We want as less of them as possible. Let's have a chat about gaps. Routing conveyor belts directly side by side looks good, and I'm a big fan, but sometimes it can cause issues. If we take two conveyor belts and try to route them so that they both feed a factory process at 90 degrees, then the most elegant ways of doing so tend to require a gap. We can do it like this, with the input belts side by side, but the output belts with a gap. And we can do it like this, with the input belts with a gap, and the output belts side by side. Now, we can actually achieve true side by side if we set things up like this, with the splitter going under itself, and I do this a lot. It is in my widget video, for crying out loud, but it isn't my general preference. The general philosophy of this video is to increase our options, and part of that is about how many tiles become locked when we use a particular junction. How many tiles do I need to work around from now until eternity? And when viewed through that lens, although this last setup achieves the thing I am saying isn't really possible, it achieves it at a much greater cost of locked tiles. These are all the tiles that are locked by each of these three setups. It's only a few extra tiles, but it does make a difference. There is also another reason, in that if I am building with a centerline geometry and this outside conveyor belt needs to be reflected, then we would need a 2-tile gap between them to get it to work. These other two setups can be reflected just fine without any gaps. I will accept a 1-tile gap. I will not accept a 2-tile gap. They look ugly. There are just some junctions which, if we created a single tile gap between certain critical elements, then that junction becomes elegant and perfect, and if we fight that single tile gap, then the game will make our lives increasingly difficult. There are some junctions in my factories which require a single tile gap in a single specific location, and that one junction will dictate the position of the belt in the bus. I've had to demolish thousands of conveyor belts and pick up thousands of resources from a bus in order to change the position of a single conveyor belt just so that I could make a single junction work. This is a discipline. Truly avoiding spaghetti, I'm laughing because it's true. Truly avoiding spaghetti requires a determined attitude. Spaghetti is the natural state of affairs. Mistakes compound. A single fateful decision can dictate hundreds of decisions that follow. They can be good decisions and there can be bad ones. Gaps are useful and sometimes necessary. If nothing else, gaps are spaces for other conveyor belts to occupy. Belts which don't interfere with the particular junction we are dealing with. In the examples I am showing on the screen, the gap between these inputs is more than capable of accepting the output of whatever factory process is being produced here. In some respects, what we are actually talking about is the order of conveyor belts. That by arranging the conveyor belts in a particular order, elegances can be achieved that wouldn't be possible with other configurations. Let's take this one step further. In our factories, there exists a perfect sequence of conveyor belts. A sequence of conveyor belts that if we arrange them in a particular order, the factory will become perfectly elegant. There isn't a formula that will calculate this order. It is up to us to find it, but we won't find it if we aren't looking for it. Discipline. I'm gonna keep saying it. There is another way we can make things easy on ourselves. Change the direction of flow. Taking this same example where we are trying to split and route two belts at 90 degrees, if those two belts are traveling in opposite directions, then it can be achieved perfectly without any gaps whatsoever. That if we change the direction of flow, then we don't need the gap. This is the actual perfect scenario in my opinion for this particular setup. In a perfect world, this is what I would do everywhere. but sometimes flows come from a particular direction and we just need to deal with that. Life can't always be perfect. Now, this opposing flow concept kind of combined with my mixing widget idea recently and birthed this factory setup, which is a pretty neat way to deal with a 4 input 1 output system. I don't have a video planned for this thing. I am literally just cramming it in here because it is cool and tangentially related to the subject I am talking about, but it does illustrate how cumbersome factory setups can be simplified if we know the levers we are trying to manipulate. That by changing direction of flows, or adding gaps, or using particular widgets, or combining any of the above, a route to a potential perfect factory starts to emerge. The examples I've used so far have been for 2 belt setups. Let's have a chat about 3 belt setups. Let's imagine a factory process needs 3 belts of something and we are trying to feed it with a centerline geometry, so factory units either side of these 3 main belts. Each of these input belts will need a centerline widget, but if we try and construct them, then several gaps emerge. We need a single tile gap between 2 of the belts and a 2 tile gap between them and the 3rd belt. This is ugly in my opinion. 2 tile gaps just make everything look ugly to me. But if we take that 3rd belt, change its direction and jam it into the single tile gap between the other 2, then perfection emerges. All we have done is change the direction of flow of one of the conveyor belts and now all gaps are gone. This is how I've started routing belts through my rocket silos in Space Age, by the way. Just another excuse to show off a cool bit of factory. Let's get to that weaving intertwining thing. I don't like doing it. Let me explain why. I like to build big complicated factories, and big complicated factories have a lot of conveyor belts and a lot of flows. Trying to remember all of that, or recording it and then also remembering to reference that record, is hard work, and this is a game that is meant to be fun. So unless I'm trying to absolutely nail SBM to the wall, I build everything as yellow conveyor belts and then upgrade them as and when I get access to the faster belts. What this means, in essence, is that any conveyor belt in my factories could potentially need to be upgraded to the fastest speed at any point. If I happen to have woven or intertwined a series of underground belts together and all of them require upgrading, then all of the interweaving gets broken and I am screwed. The only way to fix this is with spaghetti. If my backup solution is ever make a mess, then by extension my primary solution is flawed, so I don't do it. Now, you might argue that there are some places or junctions in your factory that wouldn't work unless you intertwined the undergrounds, and that may be so. In my experience, however, these are all the consequences of previous decisions. That maybe if we sequenced the conveyor belts differently, if we laid them down in a different order, if we created a gap, if we changed the direction of flow, then that junction will be solved by other means. Are there occasions where I intertwine my undergrounds? Absolutely. The idea of calling a factory a failure simply because it fails one or more of my rules is absurd. I don't think I've ever been able to build an entire factory without there being some junction somewhere that I have not been happy with. A series of conveyor belts that break my rules in some way. But I would tell you that if you asked about them, I would explain in detail how each and every one of them came into being. A factory of hundreds and hundreds of junctions which meet my rules, and I'll only ever be able to see the few that don't. I don't think I'm alone in feeling these kinds of emotions. I am certain there are areas in all of our factories which we aren't necessarily 100% happy with. In some respects, playing Factorio is an exercise in futility. The exercise of seeking for the perfect thing that we'll probably never quite find. Our mistakes haunt us more than our successes. I mean, maybe this is just the case for me. Anyway. Now, in the original writing of this script, this was the end. I was going to make a few quippy remarks about conveyor belts, maybe make a joke, and then bring things to a close. But I mentioned that I was writing this script while streaming, and someone wanted to show me their spaghetti. So now I have some real world examples of the kinds of things that happen when my rules are not in play. So let's go through a few of those images. Let's see how I would have interpreted these particular junctions. Alright, so this is image number 1, and the critical thing, in my opinion, that we need to be thinking about is this patch of uranium ore. I've spoken to the person who made these images. Let me tell you a bit of a backstory. He's got less than 1,000 hours in this game. You know, he's a relative newbie, really, and in that 1,000 hours, he played enough of vanilla Factorio to get bored of it and to move over to Pi. Now, me personally, my experiences with Factorio was similar. Like I probably had about 1,000 hours in the game when I moved over and started playing Angel and Bob. But Angel and Bob is a much, much smaller challenge than Pi. So although I'm going to be critical about the things that I see on, from these images, you should know that I have an enormous amount of respect for this chap. Now, this chap, in the Discord channel, he goes by the name of Phil. But he's recently disclosed that his name is not Phil. So from now on, if I'm going to refer to him, I'm going to refer to him as not Phil. Right, so this patch of uranium, I've spoken to not Phil, and he has confirmed that most of the factory design, most of what we can see here is, he's trying to route around this patch of uranium. Now, from my perspective, I don't really like doing this. When I see a patch of ore, in old Factorio, if a patch of ore was in the way, I would just remove it. There was a mod that I had installed, an ore eraser mod, and I could just remove it if it was in the way, no problem at all. I'm kind of in a new mindset with regards to Space Age, because it is kind of a brand new game. So my personal perspective is that I've gone back to where I was at the beginning, years and years and years ago, which is where I'm trying to harness and extract every single piece of ore that I can from the map. So I'm not using the ore eraser. I'm going back to what I used to do, and that is to try and account for these patches of ore. So if we look at, let me take you to what part of my factory. So this is the factory I'm working on at the moment. This is a patch of coal. It's really, really small at the moment. It's been mining here for, 100 hours or so. But it's right in the way of my copper train. My stations, all of these stations that you can see, these are for the copper input. But what I did was I just built over the patch of ore, and then so I could build everything perfect the way that I wanted it to be in the final sense. And then I demolished the part of the stations or whatever was in the way to put the ore, the mining drills back in again, and then tried to make everything else work. Now, because it was the train stations, I'm only using 2 of the copper trains, so I am purposefully limiting, my production. We are early stages. I'm not pushing this factory to its limit yet. This is how I kind of ramp up production in these factories. Is I have a certain number of trains and I turn some of them on and then some of them off, depending on, how much production or processing I want to have. So when I have these patches of ore in my factory, I just build over it, and then I demolish what I've built over it and try and build around it. So I'm trying to build like a final factory. This is a right old roundabout way to get to my point. The point that I'm getting to is this kind of conveyor belt of iron, because this is kind of snaking its way through to get, it's being fed by this splitter, and it's kind of snaking its way through. And me personally, I don't like this. What I would do, if this is the line of the conveyor belt that we want to feed, what I would do is I would bring this line all the way across in a horizontal line, get the splitter in the right place so that, the final location of that splitter is in the right place and I don't have to ever move it again. But the conveyor belt that comes across, I would try and route it around so that once this patch of ore had depleted, I could just delete that portion of conveyor belt that was routed around the ore and put in that straight conveyor belt, which is what I'm looking for. So although this patch of ore, I'm really only looking at this one conveyor, but this patch of ore has had quite large it's caused quite a lot of this routing, I'm guessing, to get around it. But I'm just looking at this one conveyor belt here. Now, looking at other conveyor belts, the sort of things that I'm looking at is this sulfur one, because this sulfur one, it comes across, and obviously, it collides with this one. So we want the sulfur over on this side of the map to feed other processes, but we can't do that because it collides with this iron one. Now, I'd imagine this is just the process of how the factory went down. The irons went in, then these other conveyor belts went in, and the sulfur came in right at the end, and that's where it happened to fit in. I don't like this little kink. There's a potential for us to move things around in the factory to move this conveyor belt so it's somewhere else and doesn't collide with this belt. But I think what I would do in this scenario is I would just try and move these iron ones over and then squeeze this sulfur one in the middle and bring it across somewhere a ways up here. So it's only, this image is mostly caused by this uranium. I'm only really concentrating on these two belts because these are the most obvious, the most obvious places where it kind of we don't follow my rules. That's probably the best way of saying it. But I mean, this is significant. I'm going to go to the next image. So this is kind of, we've moved up a little bit. This is the same patch of ore. These are the same kind of iron conveyor belts and sulfur conveyor belts that we were talking about before. And what we've done is we've kind of taken this bus and we're kind of fanning it out so that we've got more space to feed the processes either side. Now, I don't like this fanning out, obviously, because, this kind of, it creates the potential for spaghettiing around. Anything in here, I know, I'm thinking of ultimate, potential. There's probably very, very little potential of belts coming around in here because we've got this patch of ore and all of the factory is pretty well condensed. But, in another part of the factory, it might be significant. This I don't like. What I would do is I would bring this bus straight up and then I would feed it off to the right. So that we would bring these conveyor belts straight in, and then this fanning out, if we need to fan out these ingredients, these conveyor belts, we do that on the 90 degrees. So we could bring different conveyor belts. We could completely change the order of these belts if we wanted to. The bus could just travel straight up. We have complete control and selection over what we do in this area. So that's the way that I would kind of see this little bit of factory. It's not, it's early days for Not Phil. It's only really small things, I suppose. Let's get on to the final image. Because this one, it looks really, really simple, but it really got my mind going. So we've got a bit of the kind of spaghetti where we're kind of having to root around, move the belt around things because of simple, we've put in an obstruction and then we've had to maneuver a conveyor belt around that obstruction. Then we've had to maneuver another conveyor belt. And so we've kind of got this radiating effect of kind of spaghetti. We've also got, what we're trying to do here, I'm pretty sure actually, is we're trying to rearrange the order or the sequence of these belts. So we're taking the belts in the order that we've established down here, and we're trying to establish a new order of conveyor belts up here. So the order that we've got here is different, and everything in here is really kind of achieving that different sequencing. Now, this kind of sent me off down a little rabbit hole because this, the sequencing of belts, that's actually really difficult to do whilst we're traveling in a straight line. But if we happen to do it on a corner, then changing the sequence of belts, how they're arranged at a corner, that can be done really, really elegantly. And to a certain extent, the bigger the bus, the more easy and the more flexibility and the more options we have with regards to how those conveyor belts can be sequenced. And the rabbit hole I was sent down was, okay, there's a completely alternative way to route your conveyor belts through a factory from the way that I've described throughout this entire video, and that is to zigzag your bus. Because on every zig and every zag, we have the opportunity to change the order of the conveyor belts to suit whatever factory process happens to be around us at that moment. And then we can get to another corner. We can change the sequence of them again and direct it at a completely different factory process. And so, you kind of end up in a situation where nothing is in a straight line anymore. Nothing is fixed. And you've got an enormous amount of freedom to play around with things as and how your factory develops. I did not anticipate reaching this fundamental conclusion when these images were originally sent to me, but it is a really, really interesting alternative. You could have everything in straight lines, the way that I've kind of tried to explain, with as few corners and junctions as possible, or you can go with as many corners and junctions as you need. Whatever order of conveyor belts is flexible. Nothing is fixed. It's just a really interesting alternative. Anyway, that's what I wanted to close the episode on, was this really interesting alternative to get your mind, get my mind, well, all of our minds going, because this is, is this a factory design? Is this a conveyor belt idea I want to bring together in a factory? It's got my mind going. Let's just leave it like that. Anyway, I've rambled on way longer than I should have done. I mean, I've almost doubled the length of this whole tutorial. Yeah, that's it. Belt rules. Aren't they fun?